Thank you very much, Suparna, and thanks to all of you. It's late this evening, I know. What I'm going to be talking about is, the title I gave this was Who Won World War II? There was a subtitle that somehow got left over, Collective Memories of the War. And the type of memory I'll be talking about is not like what we've been hearing so far. We've been hearing about personal memories, what psychologists usually study. People in a scanner or in the lab remembering either events that were recently presented or events from their personal lives. As in the previous talks, we did hear about apes too, but I'll stick with people. Spoiler alert, yes, I know the Allies won, so okay. We can get that out on the table. But what I'm asking is more fine-tuned. It's about individual nations or people in nations' memories of the events, of how World War II unfolded. Because what we see is that there are stark differences that we find in the study I'll be reporting, even among countries who fought on the same side. And it depends a little bit on how you count. Over 30 countries fought on the Allied side in World War II. And so this topic is one that psychologists have only relatively recently taken up. It's an old topic in the humanities and philosophy. Sociologists have been studying it. It's called collective memory. And collective memory or memories are representations of the past shared to a greater or lesser degree by members of a group. So APS is celebrating its 30th anniversary, so we all feel good from going from 400 people to over 30,000 people. And so we're celebrating that memory. That's kind of a collective memory exercise I've been hearing about here. So collective memory, there are kind of different versions of it. One version is kind of a static version, kind of what do you know about the past? So every American knows George Washington was the first president. Yes, that is a collective memory. We all share it. We all have it if we grew up in this country. By the way, 75% of the people on MTurk and also undergraduates believe that Alexander Hamilton was president, and he wasn't. So just because, and they're highly confident, by the way, that he was president. So just because you all share something doesn't necessarily, as we know, mean it's right. The other interesting thing, though, is the process of collective remembering, and this is where ideas collide about the past. And so we have memory wars, memory conflicts. They're going around all around the world. In the U.S. South now, there are memory wars about how to commemorate and what those Confederate memorials mean. And people opposed to taking them down, and people who think they should never have been put up. That's a memory war. And there are a number of others going on around the world. And a lot of the current conflicts are really rooted in things that happened hundreds or even thousands of years ago, like Shia versus Sunni Muslims, dates to 830-something at the death of Muhammad. So that, to me, is really the interesting thing about how conflicting memories of the past of the same event. So we can ask, well, is collective memory history? And the answer is no. History means to be an objective count of the past. If new evidence is uncovered, historians will change the record. Collective memory is the memory of the past that we have and that we use as part of our identity. It's often an identity project. If you listen to the Southerners saying why they want to keep those memorials, it's because of their ancestors, because they did say, no, this is really not about slavery, it's about something else. So that's the kind of thing. This is part of my personal identity. I really don't want you changing it. So a collective memory is not history, it's kind of internalized, remembered history. So we talk about how Americans remember the Civil War, how we remember 9/11 in that general sense. So that's a 1-minute background of 100 years of scholarship. The collaborators on this project are Magdalena Abel at the University of Regensburg, Shara Umernath at Claremont McKenna College, they were at Washington University when we started, and then Ruth Schaefer, who will be a graduate student next year at Washington University, and my colleague Jim Wirch in the Department of Anthropology, who was the one who got me interested in collective memory. And this was funded by the James S. McDonnell Foundation. So what did we do? How did we study this? Well, if you grew up in the US like I did, and like I imagine most of you did, I grew up, my father was in the war, so he grew up telling me stories about the war. I took courses, I watched movies, I read books, I read novels, and here's the story that US people tell themselves about World War II in Europe. This is what Jim Wirch calls a narrative template. This actually worked for World War I, too, for the US. So European countries get themselves into a terrible mess. Germany declares war, invades its neighbors. US wants to be an isolationist. We don't want to get involved, World War I or World War II. The war is going on. Finally, in World War II, we were attacked at Pearl Harbor. We had to go into the war, we felt. And then the US joins the war. We turn our whole economy into a machine for producing material for the war. And then victory ensues. And so the way I learned history is how the US won World War II. Now, all well and good, except that other countries, particularly Russia, have totally different narratives of this, and that's what we wanted to try to get at in this study. Even though the Soviet Union and the US were on the same side with the UK and France and others, we see somewhat different narratives across countries. Do historians believe the US won World War II? Well, it depends. Here's an American historian, Doris Kearns Goodwin, who wrote that wonderful book called Team of Rivals about Abraham Lincoln's cabinet, where he got a whole bunch of people who disagreed with him to be in the cabinet. She says here, it's no exaggeration to say America won the war abroad and the peace at home at the same time. So some professional historians say this too. She was referring to economic history more than all of history, but still. So you can find reputable or somewhat reputable historians. She's more a popularizer, historians tell me. But anyway, this is our narrative of the war. And as I say, the problem is, okay, that's fine, but other countries have different narratives, and so that was what inspired the current study. And I'm just telling you, everybody else has been telling you about a wonderful program of research that lasted for years. I'm telling you about one study that hadn't been published. So here's what we did. This has taken us years to do. We're just about ready to submit the manuscript. We surveyed 1,338 people, usable surveys. We actually did more, from 11 countries about their memories of World War II. Again, memories is in quotation. We're not talking about episodic memory. Nobody probably that we surveyed was alive during the war. Maybe a few were. And we asked them, we got demographic items. We asked them to list, this is part of it I won't be talking too much about till the end, list 10 critical events of the war. Tell us the 10 critical events that you think happened during the war. Very hard to code all that when you got 1,338 people. Not my job, luckily. We also had a multiple choice general knowledge test, what do people know? And we developed what we called an event recognition test that I'll talk about first. And then finally, this is the interesting part, we asked, okay, for your country, what percentage of the responsibility for winning the war, if we asked the Allied countries, what percentage of that was due to people from your country? And we asked that of people from 8 different countries out of the many allies that there were. So we got over 100 people in 11 countries to fill out this survey for nothing. Took about a half hour. Took us a long time to get all these people. The hardest country to get people from of these 11 countries was, for reasons I have no understanding of, Australia. I must have asked every psychologist in Australia, would you please pass out this survey? Or everybody I knew or vaguely knew. And so anyway, we finally got all the surveys. We scored the data. We're just working on 2 papers out of this project. And today I'm mostly going to focus on 3 allies and the 3 Axis countries. We got the questionnaire from people in Germany, Italy, and Japan also. So I'll mostly be concentrating on them, but I will show you at the end data from all 11 countries. So we had a recognition test, and how do you do that? Well, I just model it on the way we do it, and when we were studying, like Sharon did, you normally would have people study 100 words, and then you test them on 200, 100 old, 100 new. So what we did was we created a recognition test where we took 20 events from World War II, Battle of Midway, Battle of Stalingrad, what have you. We didn't mean to, but we picked more from the European theater than we did from the Pacific theater, which was unfortunate. I wish we'd balanced that, but we didn't. And then we picked lures from World War I, things like the Battle of Gallipoli, a very famous war from World War I. And then, just to be on the safe side, we just made up stuff. So we made up some battles that didn't happen. The Siege of Edinburgh, which I don't think happened, certainly not in World War II, and the Battle for Sydney, or the Battle of Sydney, which never happened. But people picked those. And so it makes you less confident of when they picked the Battle of Midway. So I'll show you now just what we did is just a rough measure. We took hits, what proportion of the time do they say for the 20 things that really happened during World War II, and we just subtracted out the proportion of false alarms to the World War I and the made-up stuff. And here's what we find when we do that, and you look, the same thing that showed up in both hits and false alarms. Russians know more about the war. Like we have USSR here, but we actually tested Russians, because then, of course, the Soviet Union broke up. But they fought as a unit in the war under Stalin. Russians just learned more about World War II. Every measure we have shows Russians know more about World War II than people in the other countries. Japan looks a little bit low here, but remember, it was imbalanced so that there was much more about the European theater, and the psychologists I was working with said, look, we don't learn much about that at all. And so Russians just know more about the war. And we gave a general knowledge test. Russians know more general knowledge. I'm not going to show you all of the data. Here's just one item, though, and this gives you an idea of the ethnocentrism involved in remembering the war. So one of our questions was, what year did World War II begin? And we gave them 2 dates usually associated with World War I, beginning and end. And then we gave them 1939, the historically agreed upon date. You can quibble with it, especially in Asia. And 1941. And almost everybody in every country gets that right, except for the US and Japan. And there, what we see is the US, even though students, high school students take history, American history, and should know that it's 1939, 16% of them say it was 1941, and in Japan, 34% of the people who filled out the survey. These are not randomized surveys, by the way. These are surveys of convenience. I learned the term snowball sampling, and that's a fancy way of saying you get anybody you can, and you ask those people to get whoever they can. And so eventually you get 100 people from that country who've always lived in that country, was our criterion. So at any rate, we see the war through our own lens. This is one lesson from this study, and here's a good example of it just on this one item. Now, here's the central question. One of the real interest was we asked for the 8 former Allied countries. In terms of percentage, what do you think was your country's contribution to the victory of World War II? And in other words, how responsible was your country for the victory of the war? And this is not, there is no answer, no correct answer. This is a projective test. We're telling people, project what you believe the answer to be. So this tells us about what they believe, not what history is necessarily really true. And historians will debate this question, in fact. And so there was a slider, they just put it on the triangle at 0, and they moved it up to wherever they thought it should be. So what I'll be showing you in the next slide, that's a little bit hard to see, but I hope will be visible, is just what percentage the 8 different Allied countries said. And so on the, what we see is Australia, Canada, China, France, New Zealand, UK at 51, 3 countries thought they deserved more than 50% of the credit. UK was about 50%, US was a little bit higher, US people. Russians said 75% of the war. We won the war, basically. And so that shows this interesting national difference we have. I mean, just UK, US, and USSR, that's 175% right there. But when we have these 8 countries, again, these 8 allies, the total comes out to be 309%. As I mentioned, there are about 30, it depends on how you count, and historians debate who you count as an ally. So I did what psychologists do, and we have this crafty device called the operational definition. So I operationally define fighting on the Allied side would be if your country lost 1,000 soldiers. And most countries have a pretty good idea. US has a very good idea of how many soldiers were lost in the war. And most countries do. Russia doesn't, China doesn't. A few countries don't have that much of an idea, but they're within a range of millions. Anyway, here are the countries that lost at least 1,000 soldiers in the war. And it's ones you don't necessarily think of, like Cuba and Luxembourg and Mongolia, Mexico, and some lost tens of thousands. But nonetheless, there are all these other countries, and this isn't even an exhaustive list. So what we did was to ask the question a second way. Would people change what they said? And this time, we gave them, shortly after they answered that first question, this one. We kind of rubbed their nose into it that, hey, people from the US, it wasn't just you. Here are 7 other countries. And then we also had a, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. We also had other down here, other countries to remind them, hey, there are others that aren't here. And so now what we looked at is what percentage would they put in for their own country when they're staring in the face, oh yeah, I forgot, China was in the war, or the others we had here. So what I show next is just that how much did people moderate across these 11 countries? How much did they moderate the initial estimate? And that's here. And what you can see in the lighter blue bars to the right, you probably can't see the exact details, but every country goes down a bit, except Russia. The former people of the former Soviet Union, like Australia, Canada, China, all dropped by about a half. New Zealand dropped by 2/3. France dropped almost a half. But the UK and the US, they were 29, 37%. They dropped some. Russians went from 75% to 64%. So, okay, maybe those other guys did a little something, but we still won the war. The third thing we did, the third bar I will show you here, is suppose we exclude, so say take the US. Suppose we exclude all the people from the US, but we average everybody else. What did they say the US contribution was to the war? And we just look at those numbers. So we exclude the own country itself, and we look at the others. We had 10 countries here, because we also had Japan, Germany, and Japanese, Germans, and Italians filling out this for the 8 allied countries and the other category. And so what I'm going to show you next is what the kind of other perspective is. What do other countries attribute to the US or to the USSR or so forth? And this is a little hard to see again, but what I want to call your attention to is over here, the error bars are very small because we have over 1,000 observations for each one of these points. But the consensus is from the other countries that the US had about a quarter of the responsibility, and they actually had significantly more, according to these other 10 countries, than the Russians did. So the rest of the world, and this includes the Russians doing the US and the US doing Russia, so the rest of the world kind of buys our story. We have other evidence for this too. So you see this stark difference. The Russians are pretty sure they won the war, and the rest of the world is pretty sure the U.S. had a little bit more to do with it than the Russians did. Now, we also did the same thing for the Axis countries. We didn't do all three of these. We just said, we framed it pretty positively. I don't have the exact question in front of me, but it was, okay, your country fought on the losing side of World War II, but it was a very long war, and for what percentage of the effort on your side do you think your country was responsible for? And so we see Germany at about 64%, Japan 47%, Italy 29%, so a total of 140. There were other countries that fought, like Romania on the Axis side and then switched sides during the war, but not including those. We still see 140% here. So this is great overclaiming what we've called in another context national narcissism. Then finally, who really, what kind of objective evidence can we bring to bear? We can look at professional historians, and we've tried to do that. It also varies by country. Historians have the same, they try to be objective, but they're the same biases built in, as I show you in the Goodwin quote. So one thing we can look at is deaths in the war. And when you watch movies, Saving Private Ryan and all the shows about war in the Pacific and the war in Europe that I grew up watching, and they're still being made, you just see the huge death toll of Americans and British and French and others. And that's true. The U.S. lost about 418,500 people in World War II. And so, yes, that's a terrible number. The only one war that more than that was the U.S. Civil War, where we were fighting each other and lost lots of people in that war, obviously. But World War II was still a very costly war to the U.S. But we did ask the question, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot this one part. Here's our story of the war. What events do 50% of Americans agree these events are the core? They're recalled by 50% of the people. And it's very nice. It's a schema. It's a narrative. There's a beginning, attack on Pearl Harbor. There's what we see as a turning point, D-Day. And then there's the atomic bombs dropped that ended the war. And then over 50% of the people put in the Holocaust in the U.S. Here's the Russian story of World War II, when you do exactly the same thing. First, they have much better agreement. And the events are almost non-overlapping. Here's the Russian side, the Russian view of World War II. First, Germany invades the USSR despite the non-invasion pact. Siege of Leningrad, the Battle of Moscow, the two big battles that they all put in practically, the Battle of Stalingrad and the Battle of Kursk salient. The Battle of Stalingrad, the USSR lost more soldiers in that battle, which lasted just over a week, than the U.S. did in the war. And that was the first time Hitler was defeated. And then Hitler suffered another terrible defeat in the largest tank battle in history at the Battle of Kursk, which most Americans, including me until I started doing this work, knew nothing about. They do have D-Day in here, but they call it the opening of the Second Front. They say, we were fighting all of World War II in Europe, and the rest of you guys had lost, or you were fooling around in North Africa. Finally, you opened the Second Front, took a little bit of pressure off us, and then we could go in and win the war by taking Berlin. And they kind of have a point. So we did ask, what country lost the most lives in World War II? That was one of our multiple choice questions. We gave them 4 choices: Soviet Union, Germany, US, and Japan. Everybody in the Soviet Union knows they lost the most in the war. Everybody in Japan practically thinks they lost the most, but they didn't. And you see the percentages here. US 64% got it right. And now let's look at actual deaths in the war, just as a proxy of who might have been really responsible. This is total deaths, civilians and military, but it doesn't really matter. You look at military, it's the same pattern. So Russians lost 24 million. Chinese lost 20 million. This is civilians and soldiers, but Russians lost about 12 million soldiers. U.S. lost, as I said, 418,000, about 416,000 soldiers. Germany lost almost 8 million. Japan lost close to 3 million soldiers in the war. And so, this, I took this from a U.S. website. If you take this from other countries' websites, you get slightly different numbers. So this, if anything, is a U.S. website, the U.S. World War II Museum in New Orleans. So we see, yes, there's a good case to be made that we greatly overrepresent what we did in World War II. Look at lives lost. And yes, anyway, it's a long, complicated story, but it's very interesting for the perspectives you grow up with in the U.S. and then looking at how other people view it. So, in conclusion, the remembrances of World War II vary differently, markedly across countries. I didn't show you all the data, but when you ask other people in other countries besides the U.S. and the USSR to remember the 10 most critical events of the war, they tend to come up with the U.S. events. I mean, even China, Japan, they tend to come up with, even Germans, who you would think they would realize how many people they lost, they tend to come up with the U.S. version of the story, not the Russian version. So we see that national schemas of the war, the way the war is remembered, is quite different. And you can project this forth because the way we perceive and remember our past, as several people have talked about, is the way we project ourselves into the future and what we're likely to do and what we think our role is. The U.S. comes out as the great peacemaker. We won the war, and now it's our job to keep the peace. And you can see why the Russians object to that story, as Vladimir Putin has. So thank you for your attention. Sorry we're running a little bit over.